一
Hi, my name is Garen Aguilar, and this is our Chinese New Year project. And this is the Chinese clothing throughout the eras. It's done by myself and my two classmates, Tony and Joshua. They will be introducing themselves shortly, and we're going on to the first slide.
Hi, so my name's Tony. So this is the Tang Dynasty. It was from 618 AD to 907 AD. And one of the prevalent styles of clothing that they had was called beizi, which was a large loose coat, which was used actually between both men and women. And you can see an example of this in the bottom right picture with the man with the orange robe. And then another style of clothing was the ruchun, which was the skirt above the breasts and was more common among wealthier women. And the skirt would go pretty high up, like above the breasts, and then there was a blouse under that. And you can see that in the left picture right there. And then there were like, I guess you could say that there was different types of styles throughout the Tang Dynasty by itself. And you can go ahead and see that in the top right picture. And you can see how the hair did change a bit, but it mainly stayed the same in how it went up high and had accessories in it, and it was mostly in like a high bun, basically. Um, and then with the collars, you can actually notice that with men they had more round collars, while women had more straight collars, which you can also see in the bottom picture on the right with the orange robe again. And both men and women had long hair, with men no with actually men having them slicked back, yeah, and then the women, like I said, having it in a bun. So yeah, that's the Tang Dynasty.
Sweet.
And then Chinese fashion actually had a lot of influences on Korean and Japanese clothing. And you can see how in Japan, for example, the robes had very long sleeves, and then they also had a similar collar. But what's important to notice is that in both Korea and Japan, the collars for men and women were both more straight instead of having the distinction between and round for men and straight for women. And also you can see in Japan that they had a similar hairstyle as well, where they had like women had the hair bun, and then they also had accessories in their hair. Whereas in Korea, you can see that the hairstyle was a little bit different. For example, the women just didn't necessarily have it in a bun, and they also didn't have accessories in it, but they did still have, I guess, a medium to long style hair, and so did the men. And then like I said, the long sleeves were both present in Korea and Japan and how their robes looked.
Perfect.
Hi, my name is Josh, and I'll be doing Qing Dynasty, and they are from 1644 to 1912. The males in Qing Dynasty, they have two types of clothing that they wear. One is, sorry, I'm trying to find the annotation. One is the more formal style of court robes called chao fu, which is these ones, as you can see on the right side. And the other one is a semi-formal one, which I assume they wear on something that's like regular occasion, like a daily basis, called jifu, which is these ones. And they have like a third set of style for their whole clothing, which is their hair. Most, if not all, men had long hair with braided on the back half, and they are bald in the front half as well. For the females, they wear a style of clothing called changi, which translates to long clothing, and it's just essentially a style of long robe. Another part of their clothing is the flower pot heeled shoes, which is their generation of high heels. and all of them generally wear hair ornaments like these ones.
Sweet. Awesome. Um, Now it's going to be my era. And this is going to be the Qipao clothing era. This follows the previous two eras that my peers just presented, excuse me, chronologically. Um, it's going to take place in the 1920s to the 1950s, and it started in Shanghai in the early 20s. It gained its popularity in cinema. I'll show a couple films the next slide pretty briefly. And you would see the style of clothing more popularized amongst the wealthier crowd of women inside of China. The style of clothing kind of depicted women's delicacy in society back then. That was deemed by general society. I don't agree with that view. But since this type of clothing was primarily used to show delicacy in women in cinema and also outside of cinema, this was one of the targets of the women's Chinese liberation movement in moving for women to move outside of the traditional roles of a Chinese household and becoming front runners in society, in Chinese society. Which is obviously a good movement, and they also achieved great strides. Regardless of that, the Qipao clothing for women is very beautiful. It's very artistic. It promoted a healthy figure. And you would see different types of styles on the Qipao. Two of the most popular were flowers and dragons, and you would see different depictions of those two on the clothing. These are the next, or excuse me, this is the next slide. The movie Love at the top, which that's the English translation, was one of the movies I was talking about, which was popular back in the early 1920s to the 1950s, which obviously contributed to the popularity of the Qipao clothing. Less Than Caution is another movie that occurred later, and Rush Hour is one of my current movies that I like the most with Qipao representation. Obviously, Qipao clothing never disappeared after the Chinese liberation movement. It just lost its popularity. Modern Chinese clothing, this is, after the 50s till today. This is my favorite slide by far in this presentation. You're going to see a combination of ancient styles in the modern Chinese clothing. You're going to see a lighter twist on that. What I mean by that is, in Chinese history, there's an interwoven history and not only the way Chinese clothing is created, but also how it's represented. And in the modern Chinese clothing era, you're going to see it take after that interwoven history, as well as take after techniques from the Shang dynasty. Um, Even though that it's taking from the previous ancient styles in the country of China, what modern Chinese clothing has contributed to Chinese society is creating clothes that are more gender neutral. As you heard from my two peers, there was always a distinction between what men and women wore, and that is pretty much gone with modern Chinese clothing. The clothes itself are just made for anyone and any who wants to wear, essentially. And it's more affordable. You're going to see the dragon and clouds played with again in this era. And then obviously Chinese clothing in China in general has had a wide and vast influence on pop culture. And yeah, that's our presentation.